Hello and welcome to HealthTech Hour on UK Health Radio. My name is Steve Roest, and each week we bring you the best news, views and interviews with the CEOs, founders and clinicians that are leading the health tech revolution in the UK and beyond. I'm a CEO and founder of a health tech company myself, and I'm passionate about the people and companies that are changing the world. Before I introduce this week's guests, I'd like to ask everyone, as I always do, to follow us on the socials. It's at UK Health Radio and at HealthTech Hour. This week's guest sees us return to the world of AI in healthcare, this time with a focus on helping to diagnose cancer. And we're helping to diagnose cancer, helping to either diagnose it early or allow more people to avoid painful and unnecessary biopsies. Dr. Manish Patel, or Mani, is the CEO and co-founder of Jiva.ai, who are at the forefront of using their AI technology to help across radiology, pathology, and early diagnosis. Mani is an expert in bioinformatics, advanced computing, and is a serial entrepreneur. Not afraid of a challenge, Mani decided to dedicate Jiva to healthcare problems first because, in his words, they're the hardest to solve. Jiva's funded by both Innovate UK and SBRI, which are the two premier funding bodies in the UK. They're partnered with a range of major hospitals, and they're really pushing the boundaries in a space that's moving rapidly. So this is an area that I love learning more about. So Mani, welcome to the show. How are you?
Hello. Thank you very much for having me on.
Good. So I ask this of everybody. What's the mood in the camp like? You know, I know that the lights at the end of the tunnel, but what was lockdown like for Jiva, for the team? Like how,
Yeah, it was difficult to begin with, actually. You know, if you cast your mind back to February, March last year, we were kind of thinking, is lockdown going to happen? Are we going to be okay? And we just sort of floated into it. And lesson number one of being a CEO of a startup: don't start your funding round at the beginning of a lockdown. Is the worst possible thing you could do.
Well, did you deliver? You didn't, but that was accidental, right? You weren't like lockdown wicked, let's go.
Yeah, exactly. No. So it all kind of coincided really sort of maliciously against our company. So we just finished our accelerator program with KQ Labs that was being run out of the Crick Institute.
That's so that's the because we had a look at that for PocDoc, yeah. But it was actually, in the end, it was just way too AI focused. But that was one of the premium AI accelerators in the UK, right?
That's right. Yeah, being run by a couple of fantastic individuals who are very well connected in the AI and medical spaces. Yeah. You know, at the end of the accelerator, you do an event where you pitch and hopefully find investors for your round. So we thought, hey, great opportunity to start our funding round, a seed funding round, at that event, which was sort of mid-March-ish.
And that's in person or
person.
No?
That was in person. Yeah, that was in person.
Wow.
And then we went into lockdown about 9 days later. Right, so it was the worst possible timing.
Oh, that's awful.
And you know, at the time we were very positive. There was a good vibe around AI. There was a good vibe about what we were doing specifically in prostate cancer, which I'll come on a little bit later.
Yeah, we've got lots to talk about.
Yeah, and I was feeling good at that time. And then as time dragged on to May, June, July, you know, we came to the realization that this is, you know, the VCs, I think rightly, were reinvesting in their current risk
supporting
portfolio.
Existing companies.
Yeah, and you understand that. I mean, if I was in that position and I had a VC, I'd want them to reinvest in me to keep us afloat for the next year. Sure. And so I understood that, and we kind of froze it a little bit, and then came back to it in September, and I'm happy to say things have been going on very well since then. So
good, cool.
Yeah, it's been good.
Good, and presumably now that the end is hopefully in sight, you guys are thinking about getting back into an office together and being in the same place as each other and stuff like that.
I can happily announce we've just signed a lease for a new office.
Oh, congratulations!
Thank you. In Cardiff,
of
all places.
Right.
But it looks like a really cool place. I haven't even seen it myself. I'm going to see it on Friday.
Okay, excellent.
But it's all the cool tech, AI, healthcare type companies are there. So it'd be very interesting to be back.
Why Wales? Is that connected to the SBRI?
No, so one of our lead investors in this round is a Welsh fund. And so one of the stipulations was that we have to invest in Wales, which is fine by us because there seems to be a really good tech scene going on there, especially in Cardiff.
Especially in health tech. There's a huge amount of investment and innovation happening in the Welsh health tech scene.
It's really vibrant. And again, I'll come back to the prostate thing in a minute, but there's one of the three very ultra high resolution MRI scanners is located in Cardiff, one of the research institutes in Cardiff. And I would not have known that unless I was, talking to the right people in Cardiff. So interesting place to start up, but yeah.
So the show, everyone that listens will know, but just to remind everyone, we do it in 3 parts, which is kind of an origins part, how you came to be doing what you're doing, then all of the amazing world-changing stuff that you're doing at Jiva, and then what the future might hold and other things that we might kind of come on to. So let's go back for you in your journey. We normally don't go back this far, but I read your bio and your 3 degrees have the most incredible titles that I've ever seen. So I just kind of want to understand what your kind of thoughts were that took you from molecular genetics, followed by bioinformatics, followed by modeling of complex systems. So did you have a path in mind, or was that just sort of like, I like a bit of that, I like a bit of that? Or like, what was the drive there?
So I started my undergrad, was genetics, molecular genetics, and at the time, if you remember, that was when the Human Genome Project wasn't quite finished. It kind of came to an end after the turn of the millennium. So genetics was all the rage. And I thought, this is something I can really get my teeth stuck into. I very quickly I found out that I'm not a lab person. So there was a lot of wet lab stuff. Obviously there would be, and I thought I'd be okay with it. And by year 2, I was thinking, this really isn't for me. What can I do that has all the science of genetics and all the wonderful things that are connected to it, and binds me to something that doesn't require me to wear a white lab coat.
Okay. Was it like the environment of the lab that was restrictive for you?
It was, I think it was a personality thing. I think I'm too impatient to be sitting in front of a, agarose gel waiting for it to run, things like this. I'm just not built for it. And, I say this to my kids, science experiments always go wrong. And with me, they 100% always went wrong. I never got anything to work properly. So it was one of those scenarios. And I didn't want to, carry on doing something that I knew I wasn't well suited to. So I went on to doing bioinformatics. Bioinformatics was a new field coming out.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, before that we spoke about the show, I hadn't ever really heard of it.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah, not particularly. So what is it?
So bioinformatics is the nexus between computer science and genetics. And what was happening was there was the Human Genome Project and various other projects around the world were spitting out tons and tons of data about gene sequences, right? And initially the computational or algorithmic problem was, how do we spot a gene in the genome? How do we do gene sequence matching? That kind of thing. And so that's where it kind of was, bioinformatics was born, and it was kind of transmuted towards how do you predict whether a gene codes for something, or how do we predict what happens when a mutation happens at a particular point in this particular gene? How does it change the structure of the protein and therefore the function within the organism? And so it became this entire thing around what was to be the precursor to what we call systems biology, which is a more complexity mathematical approach to simulating and understanding biological systems in silico. So
was bioinformatics only possible because of the data set that had come out of the Human Genome Project?
100%. The Human Genome Project was the accelerator for bioinformatics. It existed before that. It existed in the 90s, right? Okay. But it just wasn't called bioinformatics. And anything to do with, you might have IT departments in a university working on a gene sequence database, and that would be under the broad term of bioinformatics, but that was basically just IT, right? That was software development in biology.
Okay.
It wasn't really taking the science into account, and that's where bioinformatics really came into its own.
Okay. And so when you finished your modeling of complex systems work and you've got all of those degrees and things like that, what was your sort of direction or your plan?
I didn't have one. So,
I mean, a lot of people don't.
Yeah, so it's a funny story. I love doing genetics. Bioinformatics was great. I did my master's in bioinformatics and did a research, a year or two of research at UCL in that particular field. And as every Indian subcontinental listener will attest to, their mums will try to get them married in their early 20s. And my mum was like, so when are you getting married? I was like, I can't get married because I'm doing a PhD, and it just came out, and then I had to do it. It kind of transpired that way, and the opportunity came along for a PhD in systems biology. The person that was involved was Dr. Sylvia Nagel at UCL. She was an absolute visionary in computational biology, and she was the first one to say, guys, we need to stop looking at bioinformatics and start looking at systems biology as a whole, systems as a whole. And the way she said it was, this is at the time when, early 2000s, when the iPods were coming out. Okay. And she made a really good analogy. She basically said, you know what you guys are doing in bioinformatics and gene expression arrays and this kind of thing, this is kind of like blending an iPod in a blender, looking at all the bits and then asking the question, what songs were on this iPod, right? It doesn't give you any insight. It gives you the constituency. It doesn't really give you the meat. It doesn't give you the insight. And that's what we really wanted to get into. And that's how we got into the systems biology track of things and my PhD.
Okay. And when, and at what point, because obviously a lot of that was within health tech, right? It was all sort of health orientated.
Yes.
When did you continue on with that path? Did you always feel like your pathway was in health, or did you sort of like move around a bit?
I wanted to stay in health. I wanted to stay doing in that area where there was, even though I wasn't a doctor, on the front line, there was an impact to patients in the long run. There's an impact to the NHS and healthcare in general. And I really like that idea. Reality hit me pretty quickly. I couldn't afford a house in London on an academic salary. I couldn't do the things I wanted to do. And I just made the decision that actually I need to do something else in the interim, and then come back to this. And my intention was always to come back to healthcare. It was just a question of when. And so I went from my PhD, from that realization, I went into banking, sort of algorithmic trading teams. And I was at Lehman Brothers, and I was at Lehman Brothers when it collapsed, which was interesting times.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
Are you one of the guys walking out with the cardboard boxes kind of thing?
You know what? One of the films, I can't remember, there were 3 films or so around Lehman Brothers. One of them was like this semi-fictional, semi-documentary type of film. And I'm actually in one of those films. You can see me in my salmon shirt on the 4th floor, just sort of laughing with my colleagues, thinking, what the hell is going on? Yeah, no, it was really interesting times because, well, as you know, it precipitated everything else that came after it that lasted years and years and years.
Yeah.
But in my defense, I wasn't a banker, so
I wasn't. There's no judgment here, no judgment. So was it more like you were waiting for the vehicle to come along to bring you back to health?
Yeah, I think so. And at the time there wasn't as much a startup scene. There was a startup scene, of course, but it wasn't as hard hitting, and it wasn't as vibrant as it has been in the last few years in London.
Oh, and particularly in health tech. I mean, there seems to have been a huge explosion.
Well, if you talk about healthcare startups in 2008, you'd be talking about pharmaceuticals, you'd be talking about life sciences, you'd be talking about 10-year cycles of a company starting up, getting 50 million quid in everything up to Series D to come up with a drug discovery or a drug.
It was really pharma and drug discovery. Digital healthcare wasn't really a thing yet.
Exactly, it wasn't really there. Only very few people picked up on that to begin with. And those guys, I suppose, are the ones that really developed in the end. But yeah, so it's sort of mid. So actually, I had actually started a startup with a friend of mine in 2011. That was in hospitality. That's still going actually. Shout out to Epicuri. Download it. And that. So, but that's the. We also suffered because of COVID for that particular startup. But it wasn't really until kind of so 2015, 2016 when I thought, okay, now is the time. I've done the things I needed to do. Actually, interestingly, all the things that I picked up in my PhD from the mathematical algorithmic perspective were all applicable equally in fintech.
Okay.
And I just saw this parallel in every project, every sort of angle that I used to work in. There was always this issue of how do you get better simulations of the complex system that you're trying to replicate, right? And it always, I suppose not always, but in my mind, it was always a matter of break down the problem into small parts, and the amalgamation of all of those parts will give us a better sort of simulation of the whole, and a more tractable.
And why are you trying to replicate the complex system? Is you trying to replicate it in order to understand it? Is that the?
I think there are two reasons. There are two reasons. One is that complex systems, by the very definition of the word, are emergent and difficult to understand and have far greater layers of meaning than meets the eye. The second is you want to be able to reason with them. You want to be able to predict them and explain them, and so for all of those reasons, you want to be able to create a replica in silico.
Right. Because if you can't create a replica, you don't have any kind of like substrate to test things on.
Yeah. I mean,
the
classic example that we're not there yet, right? But if you could have a almost perfect digital replica of the human system as a complex system, right? You would not need to have extensive clinical trials for COVID, for the COVID vaccine.
Right. You could run it through the digital system.
Run it through the simulation. Right. And so long as it has a very high efficacy rate for immune response, then at least part of the way. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying it mitigates.
But with all diseases, that's where you want to get to.
That's exactly, and that's the dream, right? The dream is that we're able to predict these things with a high level of accuracy, and be able to take away the risks. So clinical trials there's a clear risk to human health there. It's an accepted risk because you have to go through a human clinical trial to get a drug through.
But there's still a risk.
And if we had a drug going through clinical trial and we could predict that, hey, this drug increases the possible incidence of heart disease or stroke or something, then that's something worth picking up on in simulations.
And also the clinical trials are also kind of like linear in the sense that you have to like recruit volunteers, test volunteers, whereas you can only parallel process so much, and also they're extremely expensive. Whereas if you have a digital system, effectively you can be parallel processing a kind of almost infinite number of trials or procedures or whatever you want to do through the system at a much lower. An increment a tiny cost per
exactly
test.
So the simile is what accountants used to be able to do in 6 months on paper spreadsheets, they can now do in an hour on Excel, right? And they can run those tests really, really quickly. It's the same. We want to get to the same goal. I mean, and that's just one avenue. I'm just talking about this little corner.
Yeah. And so when you did your PhD with this visionary lady, I can't remember what was her name.
Sylvia Nagel.
Sylvia Nagel. Was that her dream? Was that the dream? That it was almost like a sort of like a forward facing, this is where we're getting to, this is the vision sort of thing.
In part, I think that was her dream, and I mean she had lots of other things going, but in terms of biochemistry and genetics, she was from a biochemistry background, and I think she was one of the very few people right at the beginning not to get super excited about technologies like gene expression arrays. So gene expression arrays were these, these 1 inch by 1 inch or even smaller, so sort of like 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter little squares, chips, and they would have thousands of tiny little dots on them, and you would run a serum over it, and after you run the serum, it would tell you what genes are being expressed in that cell, right? And that would give you an expression. So you could compare normal cells versus cancerous cells, and you can see, okay, right, so this particular gene has been knocked out, therefore that's got to do something with apoptosis or something.
A bit like trying to find a needle in a haystack sort of thing, like running these serum arrays and seeing which one gets knocked out with that one, and then like that strikes me as a kind of a long-winded way to do it.
It is, and it does give you a ton of data. It gives you a ton of data, but it doesn't necessarily give you the whole systems view of things. And that's where she was going. She was saying, well, that's one little cogwheel, and we're talking about this enormously complex system. We don't have the computational capacity to be able to simulate it. We don't even have the algorithmic capacity to simulate it. How do we get to that point? And that's where we started off the question for the PhD. So my specifically what the question that I was trying to answer was, we have loads of different models that describe growth. We have models that describe angiogenesis, so how vascularization happens inside a tumor. We have lots of models about how a tumor responds to therapy. So all these different sort of contexts. So we had different models of these things. How do we get all of these things to cooperate? How do we get all of these things to be simulated?
Yes, because otherwise you've got, not competing is the wrong word, but you've got totally discrete models about how one thing operates, but they might not necessarily like work together or gel together, or you can't run them together because they're completely different.
And the interesting thing, one of the interesting outcomes, which is not actually that surprising when you think about complex systems, is that when you actually merge them together, you get these behaviors that are not present in either of the models. And actually, when you compare that to the real system, they were a lot more real system-like than they were the stylized individual models. And so that's where the journey started. This idea that you need to be able to fuse these things together. You need to fuse models together.
So was that this idea of fusing different models into something that's greater than the sum of its parts? Was that always sort of like a guiding principle for you?
Absolutely. And I right from that point, I saw everything through that lens. So when we were in the banking world, I didn't go straight into algorithmic trading. I was all on the IT side and all moved into all quant trading teams. And the more I worked on the algorithmic side of things, the more I could see, well, we're breaking this enormously complex system, which includes market dynamics, which is a function of human psychology and geopolitical situations and news and all sorts of other things. We're breaking these things down into these tiny molecules of models, and we are creating sometimes very lucrative but also sort of very impactful trading algos based on these tiny slivers of information from the complex system, from this big, huge complex system.
Yeah.
Surely the better idea is to put all these things together, and because that this thing over here, right? The microdynamics of FX in cable, USD, GBP, USD is intrinsically sort of related to news from the Bank of England and the Fed. And there's got to be this interplay as well as the other things that are happening that plays. So how do you put those things together?
Yeah.
Of course, when it comes to high frequency trading, you don't have that luxury of being able to by definition, you're trying to execute things on a microsecond type of scale. So you just have to have the time to do an in silico simulation before making a trading decision. So that's understood. But this is everywhere, whether you look in healthcare, finance, predicting when automobile parts will fail. Everything involves this hugely complex set of inputs. And when we look at AI in general, we look at one vertical, we look at one thing and say, okay, let's try to predict this one thing.
That's what they call narrow AI, is that right? Narrow AI.
So yeah, that's how I would define narrow AI.
Yeah.
Unimodal, single mode AI. That's how I would define it. So you look at one vertical, and it might be the most important vertical. I'm not saying that's not important. You look at this one vertical to the exclusion of everything else and try to predict it. Yeah, and we really should be looking at things in a wider scope. And just to drive home the point, case in point, right? GPT-3, amazing piece of tech that came out. I don't know if you know about GPT-3. That's basically like it's a piece of AI that can literally write poetry. And you start it off and it can start, writing natural language. It's super, super cool tech. Wow. It took something like, I can't remember what the number is, something like 17 billion length vector to as an input. The training was ridiculously long. God knows how many kilowatts of energy it took to train that model.
A huge project, basically.
Huge project. You can't remember when you were 3 years old, but when you were 3 years old, you did not read the whole dictionary to learn how to speak, right? You just learned it from your mum and dad. You learned it from nursery. You were putting things together. Your brain is amazing at putting these things together.
It was making its own connections, building its own neural pathways, doing what it was doing.
Yeah, and I imagine my son's 9 years old. He has maths classes and English classes separately. I imagine his brain is pretty good at putting those things together. His maths teacher is talking in English, explaining a problem in English, which is a mathematical problem, but a different part of his brain, different neural network in his brain is putting those concepts together. Your brain is great at meshing these things together. That's what we need to replicate to get better, to get to this point where we all talk about general AI and talking about, AIs that can be as good, if not better than human beings. We can't even conceive of getting to that point when we don't have a fundamental understanding or a fundamental set of theories for fusion. Otherwise, you're looking at trying to learn the whole world in one go.
You're basically looking at having like millions, if not billions, of unimodal systems, right?
Yeah.
That are really, 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 really good at poetry, or really, 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 really good at, I don't know, hangman, or really, really good at whatever.
Or maybe they're not good at any of them. Maybe they're just okay. Right. All of them, but when those just okay models get put together, I mean, we've seen this in a technology called ensemble tech. So in ensemble tech, you take lots of AIs, a similar idea to what we're saying. You take lots of AIs or lots of models, and you take the outputs from each model, and you put some kind of decision tree on top of it. So you believe one model over another in certain circumstances, or you take an average or a weighted average, this kind of thing. And that's been proven again and again in various research papers that you can have lots of models that are okay at the categorization or classification problem, but together they perform really well. Right? And that's what we're trying to achieve. We don't necessarily need amazing models for each of these little verticals. We just need good enough models. Right? And that's the basis. I mean, that's still step one. Step two is trying to think of a way of,
So what was the one moment, your epiphany, that brought you back to health tech with Jiva? What's that? And then let's go on to all of the amazing stuff that you guys are doing or have done, because based off of that vision that you had when you're doing your PhD, you're actually really making it happen in reality with Jiva, focused on some really, really critical healthcare problems. So what was that turning point, or that moment of epiphany that brought you back to health tech?
So I would say there were two moments. So one moment was when I was within the banking sort of arena, and I had an argument with a colleague. It wasn't even a colleague, he was a sales guy. And it's someone I didn't really interact with much. And it was, there were raised voices, as you have on the trading floor. That's just the way it is on the trading floor. There's a lot of testosterone. And and he walked away, and I thought at that point, I'd never do that ordinarily. I mean, I have
Right,
arguments.
you wouldn't have an argument about what you were arguing about. It was the
Yeah,
environment.
I felt I'd lost my heart and soul in this
Right.
business, and I
Okay.
thought, okay, this is the moment where I thought that's I
Yeah.
need to get out of this. At least I need to get out of this atmosphere.
Okay.
So I went to a different company. It was still within algorithmic trading, and even then it was slowly kind of ebbing away. The interest was ebbing away, and I was reading in, back then I was on Facebook. I'm not on Facebook anymore, but reading articles on Facebook about, such and such are doing this in AI. Facebook AI was becoming a thing.
Yeah.
Um,
People were like, was it when people really started to look at like using AI to analyze medical imagery and things like that at the
DeepMind.
beginning of that? DeepMind. Okay.
DeepMind was at the time, and actually one of the guys that I worked with in that company that I was at, he went over to DeepMind just before it became a really big thing. And
good move.
Yeah, good move. Yeah, exactly.
Good move.
To the point where on his LinkedIn profile, he had to put in his LinkedIn profile description, if you have any questions about DeepMind, please don't connect with me because I'm not going to answer any questions.
Wow. Wow. Okay.
So it's at that point I thought, you know what, I missed a trick here. I was in that area,
Right.
and I could have continued and I didn't. And so a very good friend of mine from university, Chetan Kehir, who is, we were at uni together, undergrad. So he's been a friend of like 25 years now. And he was saying at the time, healthcare data in general, actually, it wasn't just healthcare, but data in general, this is the thing, this is the next big thing that we need to look at. What do you think we should do? And that question just kept on coming up again and again and again over the years. So this was from 2014-ish to 2016. And then by then I'd already transitioned to another startup. So I'd already said I'd give up on this banking stuff, and I'm going to go into healthcare again. And I worked for a company called Cupris, who I still have a working relationship with, just sort of with the guys that started it. And as a CTO, and so this question has kept on coming up again and again, and eventually Chet made the move to join the clinical entrepreneurship program under
NHS program.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, so that was run at the time, that was being run by Prof. Tony Young, and it was started off by another chap named Paul Gowden, and Chet was like, you should see some of the companies here that are just, we've got to join this program and we've got to do something here.
Right.
And actually,
just to touch on that, because I think you've kind of underplayed this program slightly. So it's basically the NHS Clinical Entrepreneur Program is sort of the premier program for anyone working within the NHS who wants to develop an idea that they've had into a business. It's unbelievably well regarded, not just within the NHS, but also within the health tech industry. So for you and for Chetan to be on that is pretty special.
Yeah, and that's down to Chet. Actually, he was amazing at getting the ear of Prof. Young, and trying to wrangle things out of him. It was really quite something to behold. So it was funny.
Chetan's a good networker.
He is, and it was funny that we had a call with Prof. Young a few weeks ago, and he said to Chet that you're one of these people that just don't leave me alone, and that's why I know you'll be successful. He's amazing at that kind of stuff. So we went through that program, and Prof. Young, being a urologist, introduced us to Professor Prokar Dasgupta, and who is at the time was the chief editor-in-chief of the BJUI, which is the urological journal of choice globally, and
so kind of a big deal in the field.
He really is a big deal in the field, and he basically told us right from the outset, look guys, there is a specific problem in prostate cancer diagnostics. We have an issue where the radiological diagnosis, so uroradiologists or radiologists that look at these scans, are incredibly subjective. So you could have so you could have you could have 5 radiologists, and one of them might say cancer, another might say it's okay, and the others might say, oh well, we're not sure. And
Is it that much of a spread? It's that varied.
Yeah, it's a big variance, and
wow.
And this is the problem that, put things into context, right? So there were more prostate cancer diagnoses in the run up to lockdown last year than there were breast cancer diagnoses.
Wow. So there were more people diagnosed with prostate cancer in the UK prior to COVID than people being diagnosed with breast cancer.
Correct. So every year around 50,000 diagnosed, probably, confidently I could say more that were not diagnosed or, sort of fell off the list somehow. And now imagine you have, your clinical steps are first of all, you get a PSA test, which is a blood test.
It's a prostate-specific antigen test.
Correct, yeah. And that measures the level in your blood. Now, that by itself is a really poor indicator of prostate cancer.
Yeah, there's been a lot of controversy around that particular test in the diagnostic value of it.
Exactly, and especially at the early stage level, right? And the fact that, a man of my age, I'm almost 42, sorry, I'm almost 22, but a man of my age.
There was a problem on the line there. It was kind of like
internet,
bit of static.
Who is of Afro-Caribbean descent will likely have higher PSA levels than I do. It's just the genetics.
Yeah, it's just what happens.
Yeah. So it's not a very good indicator.
I've heard that longitudinally, if you track it over time, that's a better indicator.
Yes, it would be.
As an absolute one-off, then it's a bit hit and miss.
Yeah, which is why actually, the NHS is moving towards just erring on the side of caution and just putting men into the MRI scanning pathway, which is great.
Okay.
Good stuff. You get more resolution. And you get more certainty around the diagnosis. But even then, there's a subjectivity, and because of the subjectivity, you get a lot more men having biopsies when they don't actually need one. Great for the guys that do need it, because we need to understand what grade their cancer is. But for the guys that don't, they're getting erectile dysfunction. They're getting rectal bleeding. They're getting bleeding in the urine. They're getting sepsis. The biopsy, the prostate biopsy, from what I read and understand, is a very serious, invasive procedure. Invasive. I mean, it's basically a needle up the bum, several needles up the bum, and it's, remember, we're talking about guys that are probably in their 50s, 60s, 70s. They're already somewhat immunocompromised just due to age, right? So sepsis is a big deal. 1%, almost 1% of guys will get some kind of infection due to the biopsy, whether or not they have cancer. And the cost to the NHS to actually, or cost to all healthcare systems in the world to just cope with those guys coming back to hospital, spending several nights, getting looked after by doctors and nurses, all that time being spent by doctors and nurses when they should be spending on the guys that actually do need their attention on the cancer side, is phenomenal. So, we did as much analysis as we could with the data that we had. We found that something like, over £100 million a year in just treating biopsy false positives, almost $4 billion in the US.
Wow.
So it's an incredible amount of money.
So is it that due to the range of possible interpretations of a scan, is it an MRI scan? Is that right?
Yeah, MRI. Yeah.
An MRI scan with prostate cancer, clinicians are sort of trained to err on the side of caution and refer people to biopsy if there's any question. And unless it's a completely clear no, you go for a biopsy. And there's quite a large number of people that don't need a biopsy because it's a false positive in effect.
Exactly.
So, and how have you worked with Jiva to address that issue?
Yeah, so Jiva, so at the time, I'll go back to when we were at the Clinical Entrepreneurship Program. At the time, introduced to this problem, we were a startup doing it the wrong way around. We had a solution, we didn't have a problem.
Trying to find a problem.
Yeah. And usually most entrepreneurs will tell you, go back to your day job because that's not how you start a business. But Actually,
it depends how good your tech is.
yeah, exactly. But actually, the general problem we were trying to fix was this multimodal AI problem. The next generation of AI, we were trying to find application areas for it. And it seemed to us a difficult enough arena to go into healthcare, right? So in no other sector, I mean, very few, I won't say no other, very few other sectors, you get as complex data, as dynamic data. And even when you do get it, the stuff is patchy. It's not even all there yet. And how do you cope? How do you cope with those complexities in a system that is in itself the complex by definition? So it was a nice way to approach it. And so we came up with this problem. Well, we were presented with this problem. How do you diagnose prostate cancers better? And we were able to develop a proof of concept that was actually pretty quick. We almost got to 90% using our Jiva model rather than using deep learning. And there was a reason. I'll come back to that. There's a reason why we didn't use convolutional neural nets, which is all the rage nowadays. We use our own proprietary Jiva model to create a machine learning model for prostate cancer diagnostics. Just looking at the MRI image, or actually it's a set of MRI images, because you have lots and lots of images through the axis. And we were already in our proof of concept better sensitivity than a human being.
Oh, wow.
So
and can I just ask a basic question? So with the data inputs to your model, are they the MRI scans, or do you take in other information as well, or is it just
for now it's actually just the scans, right? But this is why I said I'll come back to the Jiva model, and so you raised it at the right time. When it comes to the point where we need to include other modalities for the patients, so the PSA level, or perhaps there are genetic components that we can
family history,
exactly, right?
Conditions,
exactly. So all of these things. We can ethnicity, a big one. So we can start merging all these things into the single model to make an even better prediction of whether this is a prostate cancer. So that's why we've gone down this way of doing things rather than the traditional convoluted neural net way of doing things, because that way of doing things doesn't really give us that ability to merge things together.
So the neural net piece, that's really is that more like where you just sort of let it run itself and it sort of figures it out on its own sort of thing?
So the methodology is the same. So the concept is the same. So think of the neural network as just a black box, and it takes a bunch of inputs. It somehow munges some calculations together, and it comes up with an output, a prediction, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And it does that multiple times in the training process and tries to optimize itself so that it's generalized or mostly correct given your training data set. Exactly the same. Jiva does exactly the same thing. We just don't use this concept of perceptrons inside our model. So this perceptron is where you have like a network of nodes and weights between the nodes, and it's the weights that you're trying to optimize in a neural network model. And yet there's literally millions of ways you can cut a neural network, and you have a veritable zoo of different types of neural networks, but they're all basically variations of this basic component.
But let's go back to the prostate cancer.
Yeah, so we built this model, and we got to the point where actually, not only is there a whole business in doing a prostate cancer diagnostic, there's actually a whole business in doing this whole fusion as a platform. And we're going to use, the idea was that we would use the prostate cancer diagnostics as a use case for the platform, the general technology. And in the same way, in parallel, we did a liver disease diagnostic, and that's something that's funded by Innovate UK. And
that's the big grant that you received from the SBRI and Innovate UK. Is that right?
That's right. So from Innovate UK. So we got a grant from Innovate UK to look at primary care level data, so socioeconomic backgrounds and smoker, non-smoker, diets, that kind of thing, and to predict whether these patients have liver disease or will at some point get liver disease.
Oh wow! And so you're actually taking in multimodal data and trying to build a predictive model.
Exactly. We just started on this journey, so it's not, because of COVID, it was delayed. But we just started in September-ish, and we taking this data in, and again, imagine the impact, the human impact this has. Forget about the financial impact of the NHS, because we know there is a multi-billion pound saving to be made.
That'd be enormous
in early
if you
diagnosis.
I mean, liver disease is one of the biggest issues that the NHS
exactly
face.
and it has these secondary effects, right? So not only HCC, but you have all sorts of other things that are co-related, diabetes and all the things that go along with diabetes.
Exactly. Obesity,
exactly. Yeah. So there are so many human benefits to this project. It's unreal. And actually what's also unreal is the fact that we won this grant, and with Manchester University and a great team at Manchester and a great consortium. Within this consortium, we have Roest Diagnostics and GE Healthcare as well.
I saw that. So are they backing you in the grant?
That's right. Yeah. So
wow.
So they are the big corporate partners in this project, and this provides a company like ours with a level of access to the market leaders, right? They are literally a couple of the biggest companies in the world, really, right?
Yeah,
not just in healthcare.
It speaks extremely positively about what you guys are doing.
Yeah, exactly. And the fact that we can have fortnightly calls with their tech team and to talk about how we integrate our system with theirs is massive for a startup like ours, and that's the kind of thing that CEOs dream of. That's the kind of partnership that CEOs dream of.
And with the liver cancer piece, with the predictive element of it, is the aim to aid in the diagnosis or in the prevention, or both?
So it could possibly be, but so the initial aim is that we prevent. So, or prevent and early diagnosis are almost the same thing. They're kind of on the boundary, right? So what we're trying to do is get to those patients early on in the pathway, so they don't end up having to deal with all the repercussions of being too late in that pathway.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so within healthcare, what are some of the biggest challenges that you faced with what you're trying to do? Because I know that not everyone, 10 years ago, not everyone was all that sold on the use of AI in healthcare. I think obviously it's moved pretty dramatically the other way now. But what are the biggest obstacles or challenges that you've had to face in trying to sort of roll out what you're doing?
Sure. So I think one of the major challenges you sort of touched on it just now. One of the major challenges used to be the fact that clinicians weren't brought in, and that has changed dramatically over the last year, more than it had changed 2 years before that. Even it was a thing; everyone knew it was a thing, but now, when healthcare chiefs are looking at their backlogs, they're going to be thinking, how do we automate this?
You have to. You can't. And I look. We're on the NHS Digital Accelerator, PocDoc. My company is, as well as many other people, and so there's unbelievably a number of incredible companies are on it, and they're on it every year. But it's one of the things, along with the clinical entrepreneurship scheme, along with the NHS accelerator, national accelerator. I feel like the NHS is really putting a lot of work into promoting and pushing digital solutions, certainly more than it was 8 to 10 years ago by quite some distance.
Absolutely. And here's the unfortunate part. So there is still a wall for companies like ours to get over with the NHS. NHS would be an amazing institution to sell to, right? Because it's a massive badge of honor to be able to sell to the NHS. That's something off the back of which you can go to international markets and say, we're selling to the NHS.
Yeah, it's like if you've gone through the NHS due diligence program and they've bought your product or services, then pretty much that's a pretty big step that's applicable anywhere in the world. Everyone's like, oh wow, okay, fine. The NHS due diligence process is pretty thorough, so I'm okay with you.
Exactly. So but the problem is there are a lot of this is my experience, there are a lot of decision makers in secondary care that have to get involved to get your product in front of patients or in front of clinicians. In our case, we're not patient facing. So it's still a very long haul to get there. And I think the NHS is making the right moves, or I should say the government is making the right moves in the formation of NHSX and
I think NHS that's critical.
Digital before it. And although I still don't understand what the difference is between digital.
I think there's a lot of people that don't understand the difference. I'm not completely certain myself, but
So they are going in the right direction, but it's still, when you can demonstrate to me that as a startup, I say, I've got a product that does X, right? Now put me in front of the right people, and then within the next 2 months, I'm at a point where we can get to the right decision makers, and we are talking about commercials.
Let's talk about that. Let's go back to that with the prostate cancer piece, because you've got proof of concept. You've demonstrated it's better, well, more sensitive than human reader, qualified human reader, or
a qualified human reader.
Qualified human reader. So I would imagine it'd be better than me, like 100 million times out of a million. But what is that pathway like then for you with that particular condition? Because obviously, all signs are good. You've got green light so far.
So from the clinical side, we have a lot of buy-in from clinicians, right? Radiologists love it. They say this is exactly what we need for prostate cancer. Fantastic.
Wow, okay, cool. That's huge.
Yeah, that's a big plus. Radiologists aren't the buyers; they're not the payers. Yeah, the payers are the procurement officers, the boards of hospitals, CCGs, and trusts, and so on. And so that's the next step, is try to get in front of them and put pressure on them to have a look at this thing as a real way of not only saving money for that trust, but also having a better patient outcome in the long run. There's also, of course, the barriers. I call them barriers, but they are good barriers around the regulatory piece. So to have a diagnostic.
Have you got to go through the CE marking process?
Yes, so we'd have to go through the CE marking process. Perhaps not initially, but we'd eventually need to go through the CE marking process, and the FDA process, very similar, to prove that the thing does what we say it does. Now, as a startup, I personally don't think it's a good idea for startups to do CE marking process after CE marking process. That's just not the right way to.
You have to do one each time you picked a disease.
Yeah, you would.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, because it's a new model.
Wow. That's pretty onerous.
Exactly. So as a platform, the platform product for us is way better, because we're basically providing the tools for clinicians, other SMEs, other companies to do that diagnostic for us. Yeah. So we're giving them we're effectively like a Microsoft Office. We'll give you Word, we'll give you Excel, we'll give you access, Microsoft Access. Now you go off and create your application using our Office tools. We don't need to be CE marked and create the diagnostic. Sure. That's you. But we'll give you the tools to get there. So that's where we want to get to as a business. But to prove that we can do that, we are doing this for prostate cancer and liver disease.
Right. And liver disease, Well, I mean, if you can do that thing for liver disease, that predictive model for liver disease, that in itself may not necessarily qualify as a medical device, because what you're doing is just surfacing more information that then other people can use to then, bring people in, call people in, make a diagnosis, whatever they ultimately want to do. But you could do that with lots of other diseases. Is that generally the plan forward?
That is the plan. And literally every single week we have at least one very positive call with someone who wants to do precisely that in something that's completely different from what we've spoken about before. So everything from respiratory to cardiac, bone fracture, you name it. We've got so many verticals that we could explore. We couldn't as a startup, we couldn't possibly explore all of these in full.
Yeah. I mean, because the thing is that you could, I think sort of by definition, you could get blinded by the number of opportunities with what you can do. So how are you managing to focus? What sort of strategy do you have?
This is where the platform comes in, right? So we want to get to a point, and we will be there soon. We want to get to a point where we have a low code, no code user interface that is the front to our platform, which I can give to you, Steve. Steve, you want to do some AI work, right?
Okay.
Use my platform, use my user interface. It's really easy to use. All you do is here's how you describe what your data is. Here's how you say what you want out of it. And now just press the go button, and it will then go off and create hundreds, if not thousands, of solutions to your data set, right? And you will then be able to see what those solutions are, how they perform, what edge cases they do or don't go with or not go with. And then you can actually select one model and say, okay, productionize this model into an ISO 27001, 13485 environment. And so we've managed that entire modeling process for you. When you want to roll back, you can roll back a version. When you roll forward, you can roll forward a version. You're in complete control of your AI workflow. That's what we want to enable.
And so when you upload the data set, do you need to somehow express what the problem is that you're trying to solve?
Yeah, so it's not quite there yet. We're putting the interface together for this.
I think it's amazing.
Yeah, so but this is exactly what we need, what AI in healthcare needs, right? That's what clinicians are, the experts. They don't know data science. Data science are experts, but they don't know clinical work as such, right?
Yeah,
and so we're trying to put these two things together.
Well, it's super interesting because, on the one hand, obviously you can't have something that's making a diagnosis that is not CE marked. That's obvious to me. You can't do that. But another thing that's really obvious is that AI can really help improve these situations, but it might not necessarily be reasonable to expect that AI startups or companies will issue or be interested in CE marking model after model after model, and all of the given the onerous nature of CE marking for a medical device, which is certainly not easy, is certainly not simple. And also clinicians aren't going to do it either. So how do you bring all of those things together? And I think that solution where you provide that as a service to them in an easy interface or consultancy or however you ultimately do it, I think that makes a huge amount of sense if you can pull that off.
Yeah, and remember that CE marking process is when you want to go commercial across the UK or into Europe. If you are a doctor and you could come up with a system that somehow improves healthcare, you don't need CE marking process for that. That's just something you've doing internally as a piece of research. You can actually use that in clinical practice, so with the appropriate permissions within a hospital. Yeah, of course you can. Yeah, you can do that. It's in the same way that doctors are coming up with. So my cousin actually he came up with one of the drugs that was treating COVID, and they just tried it in the hospital. They obviously got the appropriate permissions through ethics and all that kind of thing. But they didn't have to go through any other sort of clinical trial as such. It was just within the hospital, and that's what we're trying to do. Give them the ability to do it locally, at the very least, do it locally in your hospital, in your clinic.
Basically, Jiva is trying to bring AI into the hospital and allow clinicians to use your models themselves to help treat people better.
Precisely. That's exactly what we're trying to do.
Great. Well, look, Manny, on that note, I think we're going to finish up, but thank you so much for coming on the show. I find this area fascinating. I think what you guys are doing is brilliant, and I wish you all the best. So thanks for coming on, and thanks to everyone for listening.
Thanks for having me.